everybody, my name is Professor Sabrina Isaac Barry from Barry Science Lab, and let's look at part 2 of space travel. So I actually decided to extend this to 3 parts. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about a portion from around 1903 to a long time in the future, decades and decades. So, on December 17th, 1903, right in Orville, flew the first plane. It was very clumsy, it was flimsy, and it only flew for 8 seconds before crashing down to the ground. But this was the first flight, so you can imagine it was a pretty big deal. However, the thing is, there's this a guy named Gustav Whitehead, and he claims to have done it 2 years earlier. And they still are sparking a debate to this day. But no matter who did it first, not everything depends on first, since planes were already at the age of improving by increments. People shared science journals about what was new and things that had been discovered to apply to current versions and create technology never seen before. About 5 years after the plane of the Orville and Wright had flew, French reconnaissance planes with grenadiers in them lobbed at enemies were already flying in the sky. And soon, people started shooting guns through propellers. They used airfoil wings to improve drag and lift. And the planes were steadily improving. But World War I would completely shatter the reputation of planes as a symbol of peace and progress. Now, the reputation of planes was already sort of deprecated by the French reconnaissance things, but this was very bad for them. Since now they had interrupter gears that saw through the propeller, increasing accuracy, and there was also the bombs and the miniguns. So you can imagine that things weren't going to be things were sort of good for planes. They were developing at a really steady rate, and the Germans were the ones that had developed every single one of those plane advancements. A few years later, around 1932, German soldiers came to watch the first ever rocket launch. People had been theorizing about this kind of stuff since 1904 and 5. When this guy named Constantine said, "Oh my God, we can make multi-stage rockets. We can probably make airlock orbiting weird things with airlocks." And people avoided him for that kind of weird stuff. Well, it's not as weird as putting, let's say, Doritos into a bunch of milk. It's weird as you can get for those other people that were there, because they still saw the scientific plane, the plane of space, as too utopian to ever be reached. In 1932, the first test flight, German soldiers watched the first plane, first rocket try and take off. It was a failure. But they were still impressed and thought they could use it for military purposes. And they were especially impressed by the just 20-year-old graduate student named Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun came to develop more and more of these rockets, improving them along the way until the Nazis showed up. Now, Werner von Braun still knew who he was working for, the Jew-oppressing Dumbo, but he knew he still had the funding that he could use to make a rocket. So he just kept his head down from the Nazis, pretending to not know, and he kept working on his rocket. In 1937, the Nazi forces threatened that if von Braun didn't join the Nazi party, then he would lose his directorship in Germany. He accepted. 1940, same offer, same acceptance. But by 1945, von Braun was scared because the Germans had lost and he didn't want to have to look at the Soviets. So he fled to the United States while hiding all of his plans in abandoned mines. And he also pretended to be a worker, a secret worker in a secret corporation. Anyways, he went all the way to America, on the other side of the world, I believe. And America didn't really want to use space either. Who even cares about space, they thought? They only wanted to use those rockets to counter the Soviet Air Force. So, how could this happen? I mean, there was rarely any funding for sending test rockets or dumb little animals into space. So, however, the Americans started getting a little more interest and even declared a space race, which was fought for a long time between the Americans and the Soviets. Now, this was not to get to the stars, just for military, of course, because who even cares about it? Let's just restrain ourselves to the earth and never know about everything in the future. And so, the space race began. And initially, Russia took the lead with a satellite called Sputnik, attached to a ballistic missile that was fired in the sky. And for 70 days, Sputnik sent a radio message yelling about how great the USSR is. This completely shattered America's notion of fighting against something they thought was a backwards, dumb nation. But the engineer who built this, Korolev, who was sent to the Gulag from rocket engineering and then sent back to rocket engineering via Stalin. He I believe held part of Sputnik, and his rocket models couldn't match up to the new ones America was making at a fast pace because of panic and distrust between America and the Soviets. So, when they finally had achieved their goal, John F. Kennedy who was the president at the time, started changing the goal. He said that he could put a man on the moon in 10 years. His first year was quite a failure, so how could he possibly do a feat like this, people thought. But by the end of 4 years, they saw what was coming. People were improving at a fast rate. But right after he made the speech about a day after he made the speech about space and going through there in 10 years, the moon, and going to the moon in 10 years, he was shot down at a rally around 1933, I believe. now his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took over. He was a spacecraft advocate. Anyways, Lyndon Johnson was now president, and there was a lot of turmoil going on still in the space race, as the U.S. was racing to catch up with the USSR. The USSR has to be at least sort of ahead of the U.S. It has SR added to it. So, anyways, when the USSR and the US were still competing, but Korolev could come nowhere near the new Jupiter rockets that were in steady production. They actually, in 1969, it was a long way from 10 years, but it was still an achievement, as 6 men stepped on the moon. Oh yeah, let's rewind to an earlier time where the USSR also thought they succeeded. They thought they succeeded in the space race by just yeeting a man into low Earth orbit. For 1 hour and 48 minutes, Yuri, who was a boy, by the way, I think it was his name, he spent 1 hour 48 in space, floating around and getting a view of the Earth until he descended into the Russian countryside, where he surprised a lot of people. The country folk must have been, who is this alien descending from space telling us that he's Russian? Anyways, there now was still a lot of unrest between the US and the USSR. USSR was still laughing at the US, while the US was secretly innovating. And by 1969, they had done it. The first men to step on the moon were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. I think there was one other man on the mission, but he didn't go on the moon. Neil Armstrong was the only civilian person who was going in space. He was the only citizen. He was the only citizen of no special rank going into space. Well, sir, he was a retired Navy officer. He was a retired Navy SEAL, I think. But he retired from the military just to go into orbit. Wow. Anyways, him and a lot of other people put 2 things on the moon. I believe 3. Not a lot of other people, only 1 other person. Now, there was a plaque containing the names of all that had fallen, including Apollo 1, who had a flash fire, and Apollo 1, whose test failed, and 5 people who from Mercury 7, I believe. Oh, no. Getting every single thing mixed up. Apollo 1 was blown up by a flash fire. The 5 people who were testing for rockets suddenly died in an accident. One of them being one of the original Mercury 7s. And a lot of other people died from all these extreme things that happened to you in rockets. Rockets are very extreme, and so you have to imagine that 1 or 2 people will die. And only days before, Mercury 7's crew, one of Mercury 7's crew, the one who died, said that the death of a person is worth the conquest of space. So, I mean, you can't blame him if he's willing to die for space. Anyways, Neil Armstrong took the first step on the moon, listing 14 people who died on a plaque and putting a flag on the moon. And this was a gigantic step for mankind. Or Neil Armstrong called it in his last few days, a giant leap for mankind. So, Now to summarize, we're from 1903 to 1969, and the Wright brothers have developed weird-looking things that can fly in the sky. Then people start to theorize and make books about rockets. Then the first test happens about rockets, and it's garbage. So Werner von Braun, the 20-year-old engineer that built it, decides to up his game. Then 1945 rolls around, and von Braun is scared because of Germany's surrender. So he moves to America and hides all his work in abandoned mines. Then in between, there was actually slave labor used to produce rockets. Full 12,000 died of slave labor, and the rockets only killed 9,000 people. So Hitler shot himself in the foot there, and he also may have shot himself in the mouth a few years later. But we don't talk about that. Anyways, then we move on to Korolev, who builds the first Soviet rocket with the human inside that will use a capsule to descend back to Earth. And then the U.S. JFK says that he will get to space and put a man on the moon in 10 years. Admittedly, he didn't, but it was still a great achievement for all mankind. But it was then Lyndon Johnson finally took the torch, and he guided the rest of the nation towards making more and more rockets. And eventually, the Jupiter rockets, which moved on to the Saturn rockets, started beating the Soviet Union's game. And finally, America had won the space race via the goalposts that were set by America after being kicking the Soviets' goalposts down. But it was still a much farther goalpost than the Soviets one, so you can't blame them. Thank you everybody for watching. We have summarized most everything in today's lecture, and we'll see you next time.